Hello, everyone. Welcome to the podcast, Awaken Your Soul's Journey. I'm Angela, and I am so excited to have with me here today Dr. Dean Samseri and his wife, Holly Kim. They are co authors of A Roadmap to the Soul, which is a practical guide to love, compassion, and inner peace. And they are seasoned experts in guiding individuals, couples, and families toward healing and purpose. Married since 1991, that was the year my son was born. Their dynamic partnership blends over 3 decades of experience in helping people overcome past trauma, break free from self-destructive patterns, and discover a deeper, more meaningful life. Their insightful approach offers both practical wisdom and heartfelt inspiration, making them captivating guests for any podcast, including this one, focused on personal growth, relationships, or emotional well-being. So thank you for being here.
Yes, a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah. And I always have my guests just give a little bit more background in their own words to add to that bio, just so that they can get a little better feel for who you are and how you got to doing what you do.
Well, I am a recovering drug addict and alcoholic, and on January 10th of this year, I will have 42 years sobriety.
Wow.
So, yes.
Thank the Lord.
Incredible. Congratulations.
Well, thank you. It was a long journey. Wasn't easy, but it was all worth it. So through that process of becoming from a dysfunctional person to wanting to be a functional person on all levels, that's how I got into the field. And first it was addiction, helping others with substance abuse, and then helping the families, and then spiritually being ordained, and then being a life coach since, about 2001. So, just integrating all of that and taking what I needed, coming from the dirt up, that, my goal was my intention to my heart was to help people before they got to the dirt. Mm-hmm. And if they did get there, that there was hope to come out.
Great. Beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah. And Holly Kim and I met. We actually met at a time when we were both in somewhat of a emotional turmoil. And we were both very committed to working through that. And that's why we were really excited about your audience, because we both realized at that time is that one of the ways to really grow in emotional health is learning how to deal with our emotional losses. Mm-hmm. And if we don't do that, then we'll stay stuck in those places. And we may continue to grow physically and on other levels, but we may emotionally stay stuck at an earlier stage. And so I think that's what really drew us together, was that we were on a journey. She was coming out of the streets. I was coming out of the seminary. But what we both had in common, we had a certain brokenness for a variety of different reasons. But we were really ambitious about how to do this emotional thing right. Mm-hmm. And we were very hungry for that. And as a result of that, not only for ourselves, but we've been able to help so many people who have been dealing with their own brokenness, whether the brokenness was due to a sudden loss or brokenness due to life circumstances or whatever. It's just part of being human, right? So yeah, that's been our background, is that we may not be really great in certain areas, but this is an area we do really good is helping people work with their emotional life.
I love that, because that was one of the first things that I learned when I first started going to my grief coach. She helped me with the emotional part, and we don't get taught that. It's not something that we learn. So tell me more about how you help people with their emotions.
Yeah, well, I realized that I'm big on education. I've done a lot of degrees, but I've never had a class along the way that was called How to Become Emotionally Intelligent. And so, as you just stated, that's really not part of the training. Hopefully, we get it in our families or maybe in some other context. But I remember early on in my 20s, I came across a guy that I really admired. He spoke a lot into men's issues, but it was both men and women issues. But he said that he found that so many men were stuck in emotional adolescence because they've never learned how to embrace their grief. And it was a pretty interesting concept that's what inhibits a person to stay stuck in an earlier stage. And so we went on the fast track of what that is, what are emotions, and how they are natural to us. And Holly Kemp speaks about them so beautiful. She just says they're messages that we get. You know, when we're afraid, it's a message that our body's telling us. When we're angry, it's a message. When our heart is broken, it's a message that I lost something very important to me. And so if we do not learn how to be cognizant of it, to manage those emotions, then they manage us. And then we find all kinds of ways to sedate those emotions. And that's when we tend to get trouble, because in the very effort of getting rid of the emotions, we create more painful emotions when we get stuck in self-destructive cycles. So we said, no, we have to learn how to deal with our emotional life in a healthy way so that we become better and we don't become worse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I love that. I love what you're talking about there. And it is a message, you know, that and I never thought of it in that way either, but absolutely it is a message coming through when we have those kinds of emotions. Do you want to speak more to that?
Yeah. Well, one of the things is that, you know, a lot of us, the goal is to get rid of it, to make it go away, push it away. But the reason why we have that deep pain is because we've loved deep.
Mm.
You know, if you lose something that's not important to you, you're not going to feel anything. It doesn't really matter. You're not even going to look for it, right? But if you have something that you are very connected to, that you love deeply, that mattered, and it's gone, it's damaged, something has happened to it, then you will feel the pain. And for me, it's all about learning to embrace that pain, how to love that pain. And, you know, if everybody loses a person, like let's just say the grandmother's gone. So that means my grandmother dies, my mother loses her mother, and, you know, all of my cousins, my siblings, my dad, you know, everybody loses somebody that they love. So let's just say there is 1,000 pounds of love that's needed to embrace that wound. But everybody needs 1,000 pounds. So how are we going to give that to each other when we need it too? So a lot of times it's not about that we don't want to embrace and help another person. It's that if we're all lose the same thing, there's just not enough to give because I need as well. So for me, what happens is that stuff gets internalized and, you know, it gets pushed down, not because people don't care. It's just because of situation. Now, there are some times when, you know, it's an evil thing that happens and we lose something and we stuff that down as well. But, you know, there comes a point when all of that stuff starts to get too heavy. And so it's internalized, it's in there, and we're trying to function and make it all okay, right? So we, you know, in society, we, you know, look good, we smile, everything's okay. You know, we do all of these things to help embrace this, really push it away. So as that starts to come out, you know, then we become like a bubbling little mess, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when we start to understand that stuff that needs to really be embraced, and the reason why we get triggered in our relationships, the reason why we get triggered in life, or another loss happens, and now, you know, maybe it's my best friend's grandmother, but now I'm crying like hysterically, like it's my grandmother, you know, and I look crazy at the funeral, right? And it's like, well, because I'm being triggered of the stuff that didn't get to come out yet, that didn't get the love it deserved. So in that, it's like really learning how to love the internalized stuff and taking that and realizing that that's my job now, no matter who was not able to do it for whatever reason, not about blame, but just really embracing that and allowing myself to have a space to put that. That's why like a podcast like this is really important to acknowledge that this is what happens to us as a human being, which makes us like really see how loving we are because we're in pain about something that we loved.
Yeah, there's another thing about that. In our language, we call the part of us that carries the emotional pain on the inside, the wounded child part of us. Because when it gets triggered, we often feel like a wounded child.
Right.
But one of the characteristics of that part of us is when we internalize emotions, that part of us has no sense of time and thinks symbolically. So what that means is that when I internalize emotion about something, it know the difference between 10 years ago, yesterday, and today, and symbols would trigger it. I learned this one time. I was working with a fellow, and I was just out of school, my first job in the psychiatric world, and it was a psychiatric hospital. There was a Vietnam vet who had experienced a lot of traumatic things. He was in a helicopter rider. He was a medic, experienced a lot there, internalized a lot of that, came back here, was at this hospital years and years later. And as we were sitting there talking, there was a helicopter that flew over our building real low. And when he heard that helicopter, before I knew it, he was under the table in a fetal position, shaking like a leaf. And he was back in another world. And, I was doing the best I can to talk him out. I kind of understood what was happening. But I realized that, that part of him that had internalized all those things, all the losses, all the trauma that he experienced was inside of him. But because he heard the helicopter flying low was the trigger, and all of it came to the surface. And so if we don't understand that about our internalized emotions, we become real susceptible to do that. So if we look at something like grief and loss, it's real natural to have waves of grief when we hit anniversaries, or there's certain things that remind us about the person that we lost. I remember my father was 7 years old when he lost his dad. And, we're Italian family, so Italian families are usually pretty Catholic, and so his dad died on St. Joseph Day and was buried on St. Patrick's Day, March 19th. And I never knew why, but I remember growing up that my dad used to get really somber in that time of year. And I never understood. He didn't really talk about it. But years later, I found out, and he talked about it more, that's when his dad died. And it was like that time period brought it all to the surface. And he was just kind of working through that himself. And so it's real important to understand that about our emotional pain, is that it can get triggered and come to the surface. And as Holly Kim said, we really need to learn how to manage, how to love that part of us, how to give it a voice, and how to work with it.
I love that. And so is this something that you do as a couple then? Do you help people process that or love that pain?
Yes. I have to say, out of all the things in my life of 64 years, this is the one thing I'd have to say that I can do very well. Because I had so much of my own that I had to love.
Yeah, well, that's usually how it happens, right? We have to learn it ourselves, and then we can start to show others how we get through that. Yeah.
Yeah. So yes, we do. We do life coaching, counseling, and we have an online course. We have a book. We have all of those things to, show other people like how we've learned how to do it, and we have our own language. And through that process of really understanding, our goal is if we could teach you self-love, then when someone comes in front of you, your children, your spouse, a loved one, a friend, then you will not shut them down. You will help them embrace it and allow them to share the pain from today that's connected to the past. And what that does is every time someone embraces the trigger that has come up, because yes, there's pain in front of me, but it's going to trigger something else. Every time that comes up, when I love that, then it keeps me from doing anything self-destructive. So that self-destruction is completely equal to the pain that is internalized. So it becomes not just a win, it becomes it's like a triple win where all of me, all three parts of me become freer. So it's like when they say the truth shall set me free, it's like, what truth? The truth of what's internalized, the truth of how painful whatever is being triggered, as well as what's in front of me. And then loving that, and also loving the part of me that doesn't want to do it. Loving the part of me that wants to sedate it, let me have a drink, whatever that is. It's like really loving that part as well and giving it a voice. Because if you have a bad teenager, you don't just quit loving them, right? You want to embrace them, and they say ugly things, right? I don't love you anymore, and you love them, and then their true self comes back, right?
Yeah, years ago we stumbled across a phrase Holly Kim came up with, is "I have a voice," and so we somehow got IHaveAVoice.com as our website. But our work has really been, we need you to have a voice about what's going on inside. You need to find safe people to have a voice with, because grief, we all experience painful events. That's not the problem.
Right.
The problem is what we do with the emotional fallout from that. And when it gets internalized, that's when it starts to cause problems. When it gets externalized, that's how we start to heal. So that's why we're a big proponent. Have a voice. You got to have a voice. I have a voice. You have a voice.
Right.
And it's in the process of processing it externally that we, with safe people, obviously, we feel loved. We begin to heal. Things start to get patched up, and the intensity of the grief lessens. Perhaps you never, if you're carrying 1,000 pounds of grief around about a certain experience, perhaps you never get to zero, but it's a lot different if you're at 100 as compared to 1,000. And so when we honor it, we give it a voice, we externalize it, then we're starting to have more power over it as opposed to it having power over us.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. And, I resonate with everything that you're saying about this whole process. And I'm curious, what are some of the tools or practical advice that you give to people to start to, it's really scary. I know that for a fact, because when I started with my grief coach, I remember just being terrified to even go to her, to talk to her, because all of this pain is going to come up, and then I'm going to have to talk about it. And I don't know how I'm going to do that because I'm going to cry. And so there was all of this fear. And I know what you're saying about how important it is that we do that. Then how do we get people to feel comfortable enough to take that step? It's a big step.
Yeah, that's a big step. You want me to? It is a very big step, because one of the things is that if I share this, are you going to judge me? Because not only is the pain going to come out, but also the ugly anger and the bargaining and all of the things that come with grief. And, my dark thoughts about whatever I've lost. So that becomes scary of what I'm hearing, as well as being able to put a voice to it. And that, will you judge me? Or can you handle the emotional outburst that's going to come out of me? I'm not sure you can handle it, because I feel like I can't handle it. So what if you can't handle it? Then we really have a problem, right? So it's trusting that the person that is in front of me, that I've chosen to be my coach, that they can hold my hand through it. That's what I call it, holding your hand through it. And being able to that person not being afraid, even though I'm afraid.
Yeah.
Like they have enough strength to hold on. And, the practical part of it is knowing that if I give it a voice, that the truth is it gets smaller. And what we believe in our, innocence of it all is that if I don't give it a voice, it will get quieter. but it doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
So when I learned that by putting it on paper, drawing it, sharing it with a safe person, with a safe person, then I am allowing it to come out, even though it feels really loud. It's really going to get smaller. And it doesn't mean that it goes away because, if you lose a loved one, you're having a divorce, whatever the loss is, it's not that it goes away because it's important. But instead of it being a loud scream or something that I have to sedate so it's not loud, it's like I can put it where it's in a right place to have a voice. And then I can say, let's say I get triggered at the grocery store, okay? And then I can, like if I see a child with a dad, like a dad's by himself with his child. Well, my wounded child automatically believes he's divorced, right? Because I grew up in a divorced family. So he's like, oh, he's with his daughter during Christmas. It's like, who knows? I mean, his wife could be in the car, but that's what I see, right? And so, I just allow myself to go there and say, it was rough when you were a kid. I missed my dad when I was a little girl. And so instead of making it go away or pretending or being mad that where's the mom, are they divorced, I just allow it to have a voice. So when we understand that and we write those things and we have a place that we can share those things, all of a sudden we see that we're not alone, and the love from that other person of just having an ear and a compassionate heart allows for that to start melting.
Yeah. You also, a practical tool is you need to tell your story.
Yeah.
Your story is important. We had one time we were hired by a family. It was a large family, and the oldest and youngest sibling were killed in a tragic automobile accident. And after that, many of the siblings got caught up in their own coping behaviors, and it basically blew the family apart, divorce, and some of the kids got out involved with drugs and this and that. Well, years later, the father hired Holly Kim and I to spend a weekend with the children. And it was years and years after the accident. And basically what we did was we took them through our process, but we said, we want to hear your story that day. And it was amazing how different it was for each one. Like one felt guilty that they didn't intervene in the having him not going to drive the car that day. Another one felt really sad because he was really close to the oldest brother. The other one felt just a deep sense of depression. They had, one was really angry. They had experienced the same event, but the way they saw it was very different. And I discovered at that point, we both did, it was how important it is for you to tell your story from your perspective. Now, the amazing thing, Angela, was that they told their stories in front of each other, and they began to love each other in ways that they hadn't in years. And they got their family back. That was the miracle of that weekend, was the family that was lost 12 years before came back that weekend. There was so much let go of. And it was as simple as telling your own story, having other people hear you, honor you, validate you, and care about you, and to give you feedback on what I see.
Right. In a loving way.
In a loving way, because we led that process, and they did that for each other. And that's when it really crystallized for us is this is how you deal with grief. They displayed so well. They weren't able to deal with it. They got caught up in self-destructive behaviors. They came together, learned to love each other. They got their family back. And a number of them had let go of a lot of their self-destructive behaviors and started living a lot more healthier lifestyles. And that all occurred because of them learning to effectively work through their grief.
Beautiful. Yeah, that illustrates it very well. How everybody's grief journey is so different, and we don't recognize that necessarily. We think grief has many similar characteristics, but we all have our unique journey. And so it's interesting that you tell that story. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about coping with anxiety, and then also at some point wanted to talk about the depression, because those are two things that I find people with grief often end up having to deal with?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, for me, the anxiety is like being stuck in the wounded child. It's being like afraid of what's going to happen because they've experienced a great loss. So it starts to manifest itself on a lot of different things. Doesn't always look like that. Like, somebody will say, I'm afraid to go over bridges. Like it'll get manifest on something because to say, I'm afraid that I'm going to lose a child, it's like, people can handle that, right? So the pain will get put on something. So the anxiety, the fear that has been left over from the experience of the grief or different things that I have lost will get bound up into one, and it starts to come out as anxiety, and it comes out on different things or situations. And then for the depression.
Yeah, I'll talk about the depression.
Okay, you go.
Yeah, so you have to distinguish between chronic depression, which is a sort of a long chronic state that is I'm stuck in the grief process, or depression that's just a natural byproduct of a healing process.
Right.
So it's a depression that's sort of a natural response to an unnatural situation. And so once you begin to distinguish that, then you realize that, okay, depression is like anger and like sadness and like guilt is all part of the grief process. So I need to learn to embrace it and love that. If I'm stuck in it because I haven't not managing it, that's a whole different deal. If there's not movement through it, in general, though, we we live in the present. I mean, I know it's pretty simple. We live in the present. But when I'm stuck in the fear of the future, that's when I'm anxious. When I'm stuck in memories of the past, that leads to depression. So it's in honoring both, as Holly Kim said, it's through loving those that I actually begin to let them go. And and when I honor the things of my past that have been painful to me and work with it and am loved through it, it enables me to move into the present. When I embraced when I embrace the anxiety of the future and kind of understand that and love it and work with it, then it dissipates it and helps me move back into the present so I can be awake to what's happening now. So in general, depression is just it's a natural part of the grief process. But if you're stuck in it in a chronic way for a long, long period of time, then we know it's a different type of depression. It's not the normal part of the healing process.
Right. And I would say with anxiety is the same thing, is that anxiety can turn into panic attacks. So what starts to happen is that it starts to grow, and then it gets put on something, and then I start to panic. And it's, not being able to really give it a voice from the things that I'm afraid of because of my experience. And when we're able to start doing that, then we can start to separate that, I'm afraid of this, this, and this, and because of this, this, and this. And then I start to connect the dots. And then I can go and say, okay, well, I'm Holly Kim, I'm 64, I'm safe, I'm here, and start to ground myself back. So, it's really being able to externalize it and be able to have some love with it, and then be able to get back into the present.
And
like
as simple as it
saying.
sounds, one of the easiest techniques is deep rhythmic breathing.
Yeah.
Painful emotions are energy. It's energy
Yes.
in motion. And when we take deep rhythmic breaths, it's like grabbing a hand,
Right.
going down through, pulling it out of our stomach and releasing it out. And so pain management, one simple way of doing that is really deep rhythmic breaths. And if you think about when you're anxious, you're doing the opposite.
Yes.
Quick, shallow breaths. And
Right.
so when you change the breathing, it actually changes the whole chemistry of your brain. It activates sort of our evolved brain, and the survival brain starts to quiet down. So that's a real simple technique to use.
Right. What you do is you take a deep breath in, you hold it 10, 1, 2, yeah, 5. So let's say you hold it 5, and then it's like you blow out the candle. So you take a deep breath in your nose, you hold it 5, and you blow out the candle. And you do that at least 3 times. And all of a sudden you start to calm down, and then you can do it again. And all of a sudden you at least can get back in the room where you are. So the panic stops.
Yeah. So with grief, all of these emotions are coming up. And I know myself, Mother's Day was a huge trigger for me. It just sent me into all kinds of spiraling questions about why this happened to me and what is the truth and what is life all about and where is he and what is, questioning everything, my existence. And that's really what led me to try to find out more about my own faith and my own beliefs and my spirituality. And as I moved through my life, I had a religion. I was raised Protestant. And so I had all of that background. And yet there was all of this new information that I was acquiring and interpretations of what I had learned growing up. And so it muddied the waters between what I had grown up with in my religious practice and what I was learning about spirituality and my own truth. And so I'm curious about your thoughts on the difference between religion and spirituality.
Great question.
Yeah, it's a great question. I have a very simple definition. Now, it is biased because it comes from the Judeo-Christian tradition, but my very simple definition of spirituality is the quality of the three relationships of relationship with God, with others, and with self. And so that was the greatest commandment, to love God, to love neighbor, love self. And that was the foundation of everything. Now, I see that spirituality or health or holiness is anything that facilitates those three relationships in a positive way. So if this helps me connect better with God, if it helps me connect better with my wife, if it helps me have a deeper knowledge and love of myself, then it's healthy and good. If it destroys or is destructive to those three relationships, then it's unhealthy, or theologically we might say evil or bad. And so anything that I'm doing to myself to destroy, if I'm using drugs and I'm destroying my self-esteem and I'm destroying my relationship with other people, well, it's unhealthy, right? And so I keep spirituality real simple, looking at those three relationships. Now, religion's job is to enhance those three relationships. And sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. And so if we've experienced religious practices where it hasn't helped us grow in a love of ourselves, it hasn't helped us deepen our connection with God, and it hasn't helped me have greater connection to my neighbor, then it creates a state of confusion because, this very entity that's supposed to help these three relationships is actually doing the opposite, and yet it's teaching me, and it gets really convoluted. So I define religion as the institution that is supposed to enhance those three relationships. And sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes it does in some areas better than others. I grew up in Catholicism, and, Catholicism has a lot to say about the vertical dimension of connecting with God. It doesn't really talk about, it talks some about neighbor. It definitely doesn't talk about loving yourself too much. And so there's a lot of different messages, and sometimes it just depends on the particular priest or parish and so forth. But at the same time, once I simplified it and understood it, then I said, well, it's pretty simple. And it's not just limited to religion that can help you grow in those three relationships. A good grief coach can do that. A good therapist, certainly a good pastor, certainly a good community can help you. And that you get to be the judge of whether it's helping you in those three relationships or not. And that hopefully you're religious, if you're involved in a religious community, it is enhancing those three relationships. And that's its job.
Yeah. And one of the things that you said that was really beautiful is that when your tragedy happened, you started to question where you had come from because there were so many questions that needed to be answered. And I think that maturity, that's what we do. And that's what we should do in maturity, is question where we come from, what was given to us that we believe. And we may stay there. We may challenge it and say, this is for me. We may challenge it and say, I love this part of it, and this part doesn't really fit. So I find what does fit for me in my spiritual life. Mm-hmm. So, being mature is being allowed to question those things and then find what really fits under the circumstances of where and what has happened to me.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. Thank you for explaining it that way. I love it. Yeah. And I think just, before we go, I think people need to know how to connect with you. How do they work with you? What kind of resources do you offer? Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, thank you for giving us opportunity to do that. The most basic helpful thing is our book, A Roadmap to the Soul, which is not just information. It's actually a process. It's like a workbook,
Yeah.
and we bring you through a process of really, in this case, resolving past grief and exercise and so forth. And then we have a website, ihaveavoice.com, which is you can access a link to the book, but also our YouTube channel. We have hundreds of free videos that we've done over the years that can be really helpful. And some people say, look, we want more. We want you all to coach us. So we have a program called Transform You, which is a 4-month program, which we coach twice a week, and it's a curriculum. And that can be found at ihaveavoice.com. And it's an intensive. It's for those that are really hungry and ambitious about whether they're in a lot of pain or they're just ambitious about a growth process for individuals or couples, that it's really been extraordinary in terms of the growth that people have experienced.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you. And is there anything else you'd like to add that we haven't covered? Maybe some advice?
Well, one of the things I would say is that the listeners, that you are worth doing your work. Because what you will find is that there's so much love in you that the people that are in front of you that need love as well, you will be able to give what you have received. And that even though it's dark and it's ugly and it's hurtful, it was because you've loved so deeply is why you're hurting. So through the process of really loving yourself, all of that love comes back, and it comes back even stronger.
Yeah, and I would add to that, I really think it's such a great service, Angela, that you're doing, is educating people about grief, that when we experience traumatic or losses, that we're either going to get bitter or we're going to get better. Yeah. And the way to get better is to learn to work with your grief and to learn to go through that process. And I promise you, you not only come out better, but you will become a human being that has so much more capacity to help and love others because of the process you went through.
Yeah, that sums it up so beautifully. The whole concept of having your own cup flowing over and helping others with that. I've always embraced that. Feeding people from your saucer, I think, is how it was worded. But you really can't fully help others unless you have failed yourself. And I love how you talk about loving yourself through all of this. It's a really great message. So thank you so much for taking the time to do this today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah. And I want to thank everyone for watching again, and bye for now.